Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Jane McAlevey. She is the author of her latest, No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. Welcome to the program, Jane.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's start with the notion of the difference between organizing and mobilizing. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's certainly the major theme of the book. If not, I think I call it my obsession in the opening chapter. Right, is trying to get people in the U.S. to understand this distinction. So I think to sum it up, mobilizing is something that all good organizers have to do, and mobilizing is a component of what I think of as organizing. But the differences matter a great deal. Organizing is about what I call base expansion. It's about bringing people who are not yet convinced that they should be part of a movement, who don't wake up in the morning thinking they're part of a movement, who don't self-identify at all as progressive or liberal or anything to the left of that, who are sort of ordinary people who are out there in this country, either being bombarded by Fox News or something else, and who are not yet part of something. And organizing is the process of how we actually expand the base of people who come to see themselves as being part of a common movement, who come to realize through what I call a process of self-discovery. I think organizing, which is always face-to-face, it's not Twitter, it's not Facebook, it's not a whole bunch of these things that we're over-relying on right now, which are mobilizing tools. We'll come back to that in a minute. So organizing to me is a process of what I call self-discovery. It's where people come to the conclusion themselves through reflective conversations, through face-to-face, one-on-one conversations, that there's something wrong, and that they can actually do something about it. And mobilizing is once someone has made the decision, this pain I'm feeling in my life from the last recession or the recession before it, or the pain that I have been born into in this country as someone in the working class or poor, for God's sakes, in the U.S., in the middle of the winter, in a city where it's cold and you can't get heat on. Mobilizing is what happens once people have come through a process of self-discovery about what's wrong and who's to blame. Mobilizing is what we do once people are with us. We mobilize them. We mobilize them right now to turn out in the election and vote. We mobilize them to come to Occupy Wall Street protests. We mobilize them to take action and do something. But mobilizing assumes the already converted. And the large argument I'm trying to make in the book, essentially, is that for about my entire lifetime, for about the last 40 years, we have been primarily mobilizing in the U.S. We have been mostly talking to the already converted, mostly talking to the choir, mostly trying to gin up smaller and smaller numbers of people to take action. And frankly, it's insufficient. It's not working. It's not going to work. And for us to make really substantial gains again in this country, like we made during the heyday of the original labor movement in the 30s and 40s, and like we made during the civil rights movement, we actually have to look at the lessons of what people were doing in those two movements and then return to them. It's what I call sort of back to basics organizing. And we just, frankly, do very little, if any of it, at this point in the U.S. in the movement.
All right, I want to get to what some of those lessons are, but what are the challenges today? I mean, I think the most obvious challenge to organizing as opposed to mobilizing, and in some ways it seems like mobilizing has been made easier and organizing has been made more difficult because of the way our society has changed, both in terms of the way that we work and both in terms of the way that we socialize.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wouldn't deny that the challenges are stiff right now. Although, so on the one hand, let's focus for a minute on this topic of sort of how technology and people sitting at home and the advent of the TV and all, and disaggregated communities and suburbs. Like let's not lose that very real challenge. But I do just want to posit that that there are things that are considerably easier. For example, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, at the heyday of the powerful trade union movement in this country that created the context that lasted for 40 to 50 years. It took them a long time to undo it. But, people were being shot and killed. And in the civil rights movement, people were being shot and killed. So, I mean, and it's not that, black teenage men get shot and killed when they walk out the door today. That's a constant, but not necessarily as a result of their decision to take action in a movement, right? It's because our society has got massive structural racism that we have not yet tended to in terms of violence of all kinds. But sticking to the challenge. So I think it's true. People will frequently say to me, yeah, but like things are different. You know, workplaces aren't huge and big factories anymore. And so let's just take that one for starters. And then let's talk about the suburbs and let's talk about technology. I feel like each one of them, if you're an organizer, which is what I am fundamentally, they're just challenges. They're actually not obstacles. So the question is, what are the challenges in front of us and how do we overcome them? There have always been, when you're doing real organizing and you're really getting ordinary people to come to a new understanding of what the oppression in their lives is and why they and their families are sort of having a rather miserable lot right now, that work is always hard, by the way. It's never been easy. So the challenges just change in different generations. But I'm arguing the fundamentals of how we have to do the work really don't change, and unfortunately they have changed. So let's take the workplace. It is true that we no longer have these sort of like, well, someone will refute this right away, but it's true. Let me just say it's true that we have less big factories in northern industrial cities. It is false to say we don't have big factories. In fact, the U.S. South is littered with big factories, whether they're car factories, foreign transplants, right, the attempt at VW, BMW, I mean, Toyota, Subaru. We could go through the states and list where giant plants are. What those plants have done is relocated from what were once sort of union stronghold states and gone to the global south within the global north, which would be the U.S. South, right? And one of the examples I talk about in the book, you know, is a giant factory with 5,000 workers in it in an incredibly repressive environment where the workers win, and that's a recent fight. So it isn't impossible to win. The question is, what's our approach? What's our strategy? What's our method? And so first off, we actually do have a lot of large workplaces, and we have very strategic ones, from warehousing that the Walmarts of the world rely on to whoever it is. There's a lot of just-in-time production. I mean, I could make an equivalent argument about the strategic sectors that we're just ignoring, including the entire U.S. South. That even the Walmart campaign, they've been focused on sort of these associates, you know, who are people who get hired short-term, whatever.
Right.
Where the focus of that, the organizing of Walmart needs to be in the warehouses and in the production and shipping departments, not in the
retail.
Associates.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just, you know, it's like, again, it's just, to me, I mean, part of what I'm trying to raise in the entire book are questions of power and strategy, right? At the end of the day, I'm trying to raise fundamental questions about power and strategy. And if you want to talk about power and strategy, then I'm arguing you have to talk about something that people don't understand very well, which is this distinction between mobilizing and organizing. So back to the challenges. Okay, so then there's suburbs, right? So one of my first organizing jobs, not when I was still a community organizer, but when I switched over and began to work full-time as a labor organizer, you know, one of the very first campaigns that I ran was an explicit challenge by several trade unions who said, suburbs are turning red. We're not having any luck organizing in the suburbs. You know, we think unions might work in big cities, but not in, you know, northern big cities still maybe, but not in suburbs. That's about circa 1996. And so I was like, great, that's a big challenge. Let's go right at it. And so I was assigned to go work in big, wealthy suburban areas. And what happened? 3 years later, we had record organizing wins, not just because of me, by the way, but because I was working with a team of really good organizers. I had unions that were open-minded about shifting how we thought about strategy. We began to think very differently about how we had to bring different forms of power to bear in the fights themselves. And that's what I eventually call the whole work organizing method. But that yes, the conditions are difficult now, that with less workers in unions, we have to be creative about how do we actually build other forms of power that will hold during a tough fight with a tough employer. And in Stamford, Connecticut, and the areas surrounding, you know, Connecticut, posh sort of suburban region with pockets of cities, in fact, we organized thousands of workers in just a few years by thinking carefully about what did it mean to be in the suburbs. Maybe it suggests a strategy shift from being in a big factory in a northern city, right? So,
what was it? Can you be? I mean, were there sort of like, I guess, transferable principles?
Definitely.
Okay, so give me just a sense of those, because this, I find, you know, this is I would say the single greatest excuse, I guess, of why union organizing has been hurt has been this sort of this decentralization of the people who are supposedly to be organized, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are those sort of those principles? Because I mean, presumably, right? I mean, this wouldn't just be for labor organizing; it would be for any type of organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one is let's be strategic and smart. And this is hard for people who are liberal and progressive to do, actually, which means you have to think carefully about the social structural conditions, and you have to think about where can we get the biggest bang for the work that we're trying to do. So it might be that greengrocers, that people, that there are tons of workers in this country need a union, period. And they need a strong house of faith, and they need a bunch of things right now, right? Because we are really in a bad way. Just as a sidebar, like part of what I think the punditry misses on the sort of liberal side a lot is that people are really hurting in this country. When people say to me, why are people thinking about Trump, Jay? And it's like, when's the last time you left the comfort of your cool little Bay Area or New York City home and went out into the country? People are hurting really badly right now. So I say we have to focus on places where we have more strategic possibilities. So, for example, I do think we have to focus on warehousing, where there's huge numbers of workers, on big factories in the U.S. South, all that. Like any place there's large numbers of workers should be a strategic focus, period. So that I partly argue in the book that a key strategic front right now remains sort of the factories of today, which are hospitals, the healthcare sector, the education sector, where there is some work happening, sort of at the university level. We see some adjunct movement happening, but not enough. But so first of all, I say let's look at where there are still large numbers of workers, and let's be clear that we probably have more possibilities where they exist. In fact, it's a cornucopia of possibilities out there right now, right? I've just been involved again in a huge campaign to organize a bunch of hospital workers in Philadelphia. It's been a wildly successful campaign. It's ongoing. It's still happening. And so to me, the lessons have never ended. Every place that people are doing the work the way that we should do it, real organizing work, we're still winning. So the principles are this. One, for starters, and this is a challenge to some people in our movement, the first principle of the work is you have to genuinely, and this is going to sound stupid, but I'm so serious about this, you have to genuinely, seriously believe that ordinary people have the capacity to do extraordinary things in campaigns and in their lives. And if you wake up in the morning and you have a slightly elitist attitude and you think, I just need to get the right story and I need to create narrative change by finding the perfect worker with the perfect story about something and her kid and her something, and she worked so hard and now she's here, and but I'm going to actually go, me, the senior staff person, I'm going to go and be the wizard who fixes all the problems in her life. That's not going to work because she's going to see through you in about 5 seconds. So part of the principle of real organizing is people doing the work, we actually really seriously believe that ordinary people have real capacity to think, to change, to really change fundamentally how they understand the world. So that's principle number one, and it really matters. And I have been around workers in campaigns who have said to me, because I'm usually in some senior role, I don't even want to talk to that person again about some new organizer who's come on the campaign, because the worker understands in about 5 minutes whether or not the person that they're engaging is taking them seriously or not. So one is, do you really have faith and belief in the capacity of ordinary people? That's principle number one. Principle number two is, when you look at a person that you're having an organizing conversation with, do you see them as a worker who you relate to from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., or do you see them as a whole person with complicated, rich textures lives, with connections in their own community, with connections in their workplace, with connections to their family and friends, to other people in the community? And do you understand that the fundamental role we have right now, given the challenge of suburbs, desegregation, technology, et cetera, is that every act we take every day as organizers has to be about building solidarity between human beings. Like the single biggest focus of our work every morning we wake up has to be, how today am I going to construct new relationships of solidarity among and between the workers in this facility and among and between the workers in the facility and their broader community? because we have to be really intentional about constructing solidarity that more organically existed in the 30s and 40s in some places. Even that's complicated, but in some places. So, for example,
we should just say, just so that people can sort of catch up here, that when we say it was more organic, it was because they either came from the same immigrant community, people living together in closer quarters, or there was just a lot more social cohesion, right? Whether it was, I guess churches or the existence of unions in themselves, or working in the larger factories. There's a whole set of, that's what we talk. That's the flip side of the challenges that we're talking about.
Yes, and again, so that, definitely, and let me just say, an example. Partly, I do think that there's just some For me, I guess it's too easy to say that we've changed that much. I hear it, I entertain it, I believe it. Some of the people I've been working with recently in some of these big campaigns have said, well, when I started the idea of saying, what I want to do is now chart every relationship that 5,000 workers that we just helped form unions in these hospitals. I want to now figure out what are all their social connections in the community, because we understand all their work connections really well. And even some people in the recent process were like, okay, well, they're nurses, they're more middle class, they don't have that many connections to the community anymore. The truth is, it's just not true. So, and I always just say, sure, so let's just try, right? Sure, that's no problem. Let's just try. And then the minute we start talking to the workers, it turns out they're attending the most powerful black churches in the city of Philadelphia. They have connections all over the place. So to some degree, it's true. To another degree, I'm challenging the idea of how true it is. So look at Chicago, and even some of the examples I talk about in the book, the case studies. In Chicago, where you have, if you want to talk about social structural conditions, which is a power analysis, the word I prepare, coming at and against the teachers and the kids and the parents, frankly, in the third largest school district in America, the teachers there, at a time when teachers are under unbelievable blistering attack for the last, sort of 7 or 8 years in this country, just blistering attack. Everything wrong with every kid. Apparently in America, we can blame the teachers, right? That's the rhetoric and the rap out there. We don't blame the austerity cuts made to every school. We don't blame, whatever. We don't blame all the things we should be blaming, because there's been a right-wing frame to attack teachers, right? And that has to do with charter schools and privatization, and it's all constructed. It's super real. And in Chicago, we wind up after one big teacher strike where the teachers do everything right. They did everything right. They doggedly built alliances. They systematically mapped the relationships between the parents of the students themselves, into churches and community groups all through Chicago, so that by the first time they had to do that massive strike in 2012, when I went in to sort of do a look back with them and interview a bunch of the teachers, interview a bunch of the community leaders in Chicago, it was such a pleasure for me, because they did everything right. Like, they actually spent time mapping relationships and understanding the connections they had. 30,000 teachers with 420,000 students in public schools with 180,000 parents is a ton of connections.
Right.
So they made them intentionally. They knew that to take on austerity and racism, they were going to have to construct solidarity in a really intentional way. And that is what I mean by real organizing. We have to intentionally construct solidarity every day. And it may take a little more work to do that now, because less people are in church or synagogue or whatever it is, or because less people, because Chicago isn't ringed with giant steel mills, where thousands of workers do go to work every day. But they are still ringed with big school systems, big hospitals, there's a whole bunch of big stuff still sitting around someplace like Chicago, right? So the question is, are we strategically focusing on, and even the immigrant question? I think that is it's more acceptable today that, look, whether it's New York City, Los Angeles, there are whole new waves of immigrants. And in fact, I have yet to organize Latino or Latina immigrants who were not deeply rooted in their community in just the way that we thought of Italians and Poles and everything else in the 30s and 40s, who are not, that's part of the story of Smithfield, or that Southern factory I analyzed in the new book. In fact, because of the strength of the Guatemalan Mexican community, really Mexican community immigrant workers who were undocumented in that factory, them doing massive walkouts and doing wildcat strikes in that factory was the first thing that triggered the Catholic priests in the South to say something's wrong in this factory, which then triggered the blacks to take action and the black ministers to, you know what I mean? So it's sitting out there, and we've just let it wither. Like, organizing is an active, ongoing life process, and we have just let the whole concept of constructing intentional solidarity wither for the last 40 to 45 years, and we're paying for it. We are paying for it with a lack of human solidarity right now.
Let's talk a little bit about, I guess, POSNAP or Pennsylvania, the nurses and affiliated. I don't have it in front of me, but because I've interviewed a bunch of people about the Chicago strike and this idea of social unionism, I guess, or social movement unionism, which it sounds like to me is really just what you would call organizing, proper organizing on some levels, just sort of mapping these relationships. And it is, obviously for teachers, it may be a little bit easier to do that because they have a captive audience in some way, insofar as that parents theoretically are coming to the teachers because they're interested in what's going on with their students. And I guess in the context of nursing homes and whatnot, there's a similar dynamic on some level. But just talk about the sort of that this is a union that broke off from other unions and is independent, but has had a lot of success.
Yeah, a lot of success. I mean, they have a lot of success for the same reason, which is that they do real organizing work. So, in fact, part of why I had been doing some work with PASNAP is because the executive director of the union and I have, we come from the same exact training origins and the same roots, which is what I would call the old. Now, especially if you're sitting in New York, this gets confusing, right? There's a lot of acronyms, a lot of institutions, but the original or the old model of what was called 1199, when it was still a national union, many of us who are still running supermajority strikes, building really cohesive solidarity between workers and the broader community, because workers are part of the broader community.
Tell people what supermajority strikes are, please.
Yeah, it's so infuriating to me that I have to even use the qualifier supermajority before the word strike. And that's part of my annoyance with these, what I call these less than real strikes that have been happening, that people call strikes, these protests for the last 3 years that people call strikes, which aren't strikes. So a strike by definition, I say in the book, was when I'm a supermajority, like 90% is what we mean by a supermajority. When 90% of the workers or more walk off the job, you've actually created a crisis for your employer. You've created a crisis for capital. I now have to say the word supermajority strike, which is frustrating, frankly, because it's what a strike used to mean. But there has been this, because of the lazy fixation on the concept of narrative change, which I really am really against, because narrative change isn't power. Last I looked, we got a lot of good press out of Occupy Wall Street, and we haven't done a damn thing to affect what Wall Street does. So, narrative change is one thing, and power is actually something else. And we're getting good at narrative change, but we're not getting really good at power. So that's part of the problem. So,
and you're also talking about the fight for 15, where we had
and calling, and when one McDonald's worker or two walks out in front, and a bunch of left-wing activists who everyone knows because they show up at every protest, or progressive people, which is a good thing to do. This is not a bad thing. It's just, don't call it a strike. Like, when two people walk out, and then there's a bunch of good liberals who are called to show up from some Twitter feed or Facebook posting, please stand with these workers tomorrow, and there's picket signs out there, but only two workers walk out, and the store keeps functioning, and then we call that a strike. That's not a strike. It's actually not a strike, and it's a dumbing down of one of the most important weapons of the working class ever in this country. So to dumb down the concept of a strike is like what mobilizing is to organizing. It is dumbing down the actual work we have to do if we're ever going to get serious about really reversing income inequality, because it's about reversing the power inequality in American society right now. And those of us who still run what I now have to call a supermajority strike, that's where workers are still winning. Workers are still winning when they can actually create a crisis for their employer, right? When you're being trained as a young organizer, the lingo we use is like, can you create a crisis for the employer? Look, if you can create a crisis for the employer, you can actually extract wins. Workers can win good contracts, go home, and actually have enough money to pay for health care, pay for the child care bill, attend services of faith of some kind on the weekends and have a life and maybe have a little time for a little league game or, put their kid in some basic sports program, right? Which is like not what's happening for most of the workers in this country anymore. So, but those of us still doing it, part of the correlation I argue in the book, look, I went from being an organizer for decades to then pausing, right, to do this weird little thing, which for me was weird, to do a PhD. But in that 5 years, part of the question I was trying to answer was, is my whole life experience some weird aberration, or is there actually evidence to back this up? And I'm really delighted to say there's evidence that good organizing still works. So it's hard. It requires that you are willing, as a trade union leader, or frankly the leader of any organization, to be small d democratic, to actually let people participate, to let them make decisions. And that is often the hardest thing for leaders, whether they're of philanthropy in this country, who's twisted a whole lot of good organizing work out there, but like philanthropists, union leadership, the people controlling the purse strings that control our movement, very few of them actually believe that ordinary people are smart enough and capable enough to make great change again. And until we reckon with that elite attitude, that's a weird thing that like the Trump people can pick up on too. Like it's really weird. But, until people get over the idea that only super smart, well-educated elites can like solve, the problems of the world, we're never going to rebuild a powerful movement, because my understanding of the universe and my experience in this universe, and now the evidence that I went and looked at for 5 years doing a PhD, comes back to the same life lesson for me, which is I believe that with a little bit of coaching, a little bit of history lessons, and I just had this experience again working in Philadelphia, that thousands of workers can club up and make really smart decisions when we teach them how, when we believe in them, when we empower them. When we don't try to do the work for them, we actually teach them how to do the work. People actually are required, mass numbers of people are required to build real power and reverse the kind of grotesque things happening in this country. And the part of why I titled the book No Shortcuts, which might be stupid, but it's because I say it all the time. Like, all we've been doing since I've been not all, but, a lot of what's been dominating strategies for change have been advocacy models, and I dissect what's an advocacy model, what's a mobilizing model, and what's an organizing model. That's what I'm doing in this book, because I'm so frustrated by people thinking they're doing one thing and they're really doing something else, and saying they're doing something like striking when it's just a protest. So let's not confuse a strike, which has power and deep meaning behind it, and a protest. I'm all down with protests. Protests are great. We can have them till the cows come home. I'm interested in power, and a real strike is about real power. And a protest is something else. It's about narrative change in Twitter and Facebook and, whatever, which is just different than actually building real power.
What accounts for the change, the failure of leadership to maintain that tradition of organizing? What changed? Why are we in this situation now is it simply that people get romanced by the idea of, this is trending on Twitter and it must be successful? Because also, to a certain extent, it seems to me the Fight for 15 has had measurable success. Am I wrong in that assessment?
No.
And I just rolled two questions into one, but there they are.
No. But let's take the second one first. If I forget the first one, remind me in a second.
Okay.
But so let me just be clear. The answer is no. Of course, the Fight for 15 has made a contribution and done some good work. And I, as hearing in my critique of the abuse of the word strike as I can be, yes, of course they've done some good work. But here's the problem. I lay out in chapters, sort of chapter 1 and 2, sort of the more complicated pieces of the new book for me to write, which are sort of like the theoretical chapters, before I get into what I like to do best, which is just analyze a good fight and tell why they won and why they lost. But in the theoretical argument I'm trying to make, it's this. And the Fight for 15 fits into this. So I'm going to loop this back to the second question you asked of those two, which is this. Advocacy and mobilizing can win what I call the easier fights. They just can't win the hard fights. So winning a $15 an hour wage increase in a liberal city at a time of grotesque inequality isn't actually the same as changing what Wall Street does. So, or how to re-regulate the markets, or how to, frankly, how to stop and reverse climate change, or how to regulate the fossil fuel industry, or everything we've failed at doing for the last 30 to 40 to 50 years, because the planet might blow up soon, right? So it's like we have to get really serious about this. So the fight for 15, honestly, there's several things to say about it. Again, besides overall, hooray. Though with the amount of money they spent, we might have done more hooray-ing. That's part of the issue, is how many resources going into it. But the second question is the second issue for me, and it is, first of all, they're phase-ins. There's only one campaign in the country where 15 went to 15 right away, and 15 went to 15 with benefits, and that was the SeaTac airport campaign. One campaign. Every victory since then, we're talking about 15 in 2022 with no indexing. 15 in 2022 in Seattle is going to be the value of about $10 now. And last I looked, that's effing poverty. And no one who's running that campaign is living on that salary. So let's be real about what those victories are. And is it good in the end? Of course, any raise any worker gets is good. No question about that. But I actually am trying to say in the book that some of the things that we call victories are actually defeats in some ways. And, even with the phase-in New York, I mean, these are, so 15 right now would get you to about 31,000. I don't know anyone who's leading any of those campaigns who's living on 31,000. We're supposed to be hooray, jumping for joy. I thought 31,000 for a family of four is poverty. So on the one hand, great. On the other hand, it's really different than what the workers at Smithfield. I open up the chapter on Smithfield Foods and the victory in the Southern factory with this dichotomy where I open up.
And I should just tell people this is a meat processing pork plant in North Carolina.
Yep, largest pork plant in the world. Recently bought by the Chinese, by the way. So, in terms of globalization and the global South within the U.S. North. But anyway, so it's I open up that chapter on purpose, sort of poking, maybe being ironic, I don't know, poking a little punditry, something. I say what 15 means in Tar Heel, North Carolina, and what 15 means in Seattle. And I do a little number comparison. Because when those workers won 15 in that factory in their last contract, and they won health care benefits, and they won the right to pull the switch in the factory to stop it when someone's getting their hand chopped off, or any of the other things that they won in their union contract, the right to retirement, the right to safety and health inspections, and 15, I start out by saying, I rang up this guy, Dean Baker, who's such a good economist, to help him do the math for me, because math has never been my specialty. I can teach workers how to win good contracts, but math, no. So, to try and understand the difference between what it meant to win 15 in a rural southern community and 15 in Seattle, it's they would have to earn, I think the number I use in the book is they would have to earn $25 an hour right away to come close to what the workers won when they won 15 through a union contract, along with many other benefits. So, again, passing a $15 an hour wage in a liberal city with a 6 to 8 year phase-in, with giant loopholes about who's going to be covered and who's not, because they're all over all these laws, if you look at them carefully, it starts to be a little less exciting to me than what it means for workers who win the right to health and safety, the right to shut the plant down, the right to a real solid wage, the right to retirement, health care being paid for by the employer, and dignity on the job. That's just really different.
And there's also, I guess, what some would call the long tail value of having organized and empowered. Yeah. They have the empowerment shared broadly in that supermajority, as opposed to, hey, thanks, Bill. We're getting,
exactly.
Right.
Someone just wakes up one day and they got a raise, right, and they're not really sure why or how, and some good liberals came in and did some work on their behalf, and that's what advocacy is. And sometimes it requires a little mobilizing, put a couple flags up and wave and make some noise, but the people themselves have not, exactly as you're saying, there's no long tail, they haven't organized. So I was just having this conversation with a bunch of workers in Philadelphia recently where, I said to them, part of what's so important about the first contract negotiations phase, which is what most of the workers are in right now after these big difficult organizing victories is that part of what good organizers are trying to do through the process of negotiations, and this is another sort of like mini pet peeve of mine, is, some people run around today saying, oh, collective bargaining is this, old idea. Doing what they call firm-based, contract negotiations is sort of a last century concept, and it doesn't help the whole community. And I say that is just bullshit. If you've ever led first contract negotiations in your life, if you understand as an organizer that the primary job of the phase of contract negotiations is to teach governance, it's to teach the skill of building a strong work site, it's to teach leadership development, it's to teach workers how to stand up to their employer who's sitting across the table from them and learn how to say no to them and learn how to then organize enough power to say no collectively so that when management wants to make a really bad decision like short-staffing your unit where patients might die, you actually have the capacity on your own right in that moment to fix that problem. When wizards in the movement try and fix things for people, you have denied the class's ability to get smart and learn how to do it themselves. And I am all about how do we coach and teach people how to do the work. And that's what our successful movements did between the 1920s and the 1950s. We were teaching people, believing that they had capacity, and teaching them how to do the work, so that when the organizer who had some capacity, some experience, all I have is experience, right? I can walk into a bunch of workers in a campaign right now and say, look, here's the thing. Based on the last 25 years of my life, if you go that way, the boss is going to do this. But if you go that way, the boss is going to do something else. That's experience. That's not because I think I'm smarter than any worker I've ever had the pleasure of doing organizing work with. I don't. I'm blown away by the smartness of every worker I've ever worked with. It's like, it's just that I've done it for a long time. So I can say, and people have confidence when I say it to them, look, if you try and do X, Y, and Z too soon without first getting the full weight of your coworkers behind you, the boss is going to beat you in a month. So let's not try to do that. Let's focus on what it takes to win based on the experience of what winning looks like. That's what coaching is. That's a good coach. I was saying to someone else yesterday, look, I'm a bit of a Warriors fan. Okay, I live out in the Bay Area now, right? But I'm like watching the opening of the game the other night, and people talk about Steve Kerr, the smart coach. All organizers are coaches. The coach doesn't get on the field. He doesn't get on the court and play with Curry and the other basketball players out here. You could do this analogy for any sport. The coach is sitting on the sidelines and figuring out how to bring out the best of every person on the team. The coach never plays. That's what good organizers do. We're not playing. I'm not the nurse in the hospitals that I've just been working with in the organizing and first contract campaigns. I'm a coach. And when organizers understand our role is to coach and bring out the human capacity that exists in people, the best, what are you good at? What are you good at? And how do we make everyone into a big team that's going to win? That's what organizing is. It's building and bringing out and coaching and nurturing the existing smarts and skills that ordinary people have.
From your perspective, why has the movement gotten away from that? If it actually has gone away, as opposed to just like being binary. Because I get the sense there's been this sort of the drift away from it. From your perspective, why has that happened?
First, it's hard. It's really hard work. That's just, it's hard. It's a lot harder than tweeting or Facebooking to actually deal every day face-to-face with disappointment, with all sorts of things you have to do. So, one, it's just hard work. And I think that what happened was people assumed in this country that after the labor movement in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then after the Civil Rights Movement, we won the Voting Rights Act, we won, the Civil Rights Act. You can look at all the different things that we achieved as when we had movements with real power behind them that were powered by millions of ordinary people. People just assumed we won things, and they thought, by the late 60s, early 70s, then we passed Clean Water Act and drinking water, all these things, Clean Air Act. People just thought, okay, we won these laws. Now we can just worry about administering them. Now all we have to do is hire a bunch of lobbyists in D.C. to tend to making sure we implement the laws that we've passed for the last 50 years, in some smart way, and just keep an eye on what the lobbyists are doing. It's like a fundamental misunderstanding of, first of all, how we won when we were making big gains in this country, there was a misunderstanding about how we achieved them, and there was a misunderstanding that, like, once you won a law, it just stayed, as opposed to that the right wing woke up the next day, every day, thinking, how are we going to roll it back? How are we going to roll it back? How are we going to beat them back? How are we going to unregulate the country again? So the first thing was just like, because we don't really teach how power works, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about how power really works, there's a misconception of how it works. We think we win something, and it just stays that way. Well, it's really obvious. I mean, I think it's finally become really obvious with the Voting Rights Act being rolled back, with voter suppression happening from North Carolina to Texas to these ridiculous laws, like even the protections from the civil rights movement are being systematically rolled back, right? So the first is there's a misconception of what it takes to win. The second is there's a misconception of what it takes to hold on to our power. And so that led to, I think, basically a generation of, Thea Skocpol talks about this in her book Diminished Democracy, which I quote in the beginning of No Shortcuts, because I think that there's an interesting analogy to it. Like, she talks about, with lots of evidence, the sort of the explosion of, after the GI Bill in World War II, after a whole new generation of working class people went to college, people sort of went to college in the 60s and the 70s, came out, and just thought they were really smart, and they channeled all their energy into creating all these new advocacy groups and single-issue groups and an AIR group and an environmental group and a women's group and a black group and a Latino group and a something group and we grew up this huge silos of individual advocacy and issue things all over this country, not understanding that it was robust class power that was also expressed in the civil rights movement, by the way. There's like a misunderstanding of how we won the civil rights movement, right? So like robust class power is what has made substantial change in this country. And it was hard, and people thought we did it. Like, they just thought we did it. Like, even Alinsky, I read about Alinsky in the new book. I mean, if you read everything that Saul Alinsky actually wrote, his core books, all three of them, most people never read his book about John L. Lewis. But if you've read all his stuff, like, he assumed, even Saul Alinsky assumed, well, the labor movements, they've got the inequality thing down. They've got strong unions. That's all set. I'm going to go out and try and build some parallel power in the community, because I assume, he says in the book he writes about John L. Lewis, that big labor is always going to be big and strong, and they're always going to have dealt with the issue of inequality in the workplace. Well, even that was a horrific assumption, right? Like, it didn't take long for a virulently pro-business, hyper-greedy free market capitalist system to just say, okay, it's going to take us 30 years to beat back the regulation of the working class, of the labor, of the economy. And they patiently went about dismembering every law that protected workers in this country, and they've damn near done it. And then they set about doing it to the civil rights movement, and they've damn near done it, right? We're going backwards on our protection. So, I mean, it's a long way of saying I think that we have these crazy narratives that you learn in elementary school, and about how America works and how democracy works, and you vote and it's all fixed. And we're just, we don't talk honestly with people anymore about how power works. And and I think it's much more comfortable for elites to just sit in their offices and think that they can go down to the White House and wheel and deal and cut a deal. And look how successful the labor movement's been. For 50 years, they've been trying to reform labor law. They thought they would do it again with Obama. When I was still working at SEIU in 2007 and 2008, the rap internally in the union was, all we got to do is win, the White House plus 60, and then we're going to win labor law reform with the Employee Free Choice Act.
Right,
and we won the White House with plus 60. We did understand the power analysis still, and we got creamed trying to do labor law reform. We couldn't do it under Carter. We couldn't do it under Obama. We couldn't do it because we don't have enough grassroots power right now to make it actually happen.
That's as good a place as any. Jane McAlevey, it's fascinating stuff. The book is Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. There are no shortcuts. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.